recorded. Good morning, everyone, or good midday. I hope you're all doing well. We'll have a few people joining today, so I just take a few moments to allow everyone to join. While we do, just some housekeeping for the day. So the session today will be expected to run about 30 minutes. The focus will be on a number of different areas across the major changes that have occurred in the last month or so, or certainly the announcements that have occurred. And at the end of the session, you will be given the opportunity to ask any questions. Just on a related note, we will have the Q&A open, so you can type in your questions as you go, and we'll answer them at the end. We won't, just due to the brevity of the session today, we won't stop. So we've got a large number of people on the line now, so we might kick things off. Welcome to today's session by Rome Migration Law on recent changes to the Australian migration system and the announcements about a major shake-up. Thank you for joining us. My name's Jackson Taylor and I'm a partner at Rome Migration Law. And with me today, I have Yvette Gassick, who is practice leader at the firm. You can see on the screen our agenda. We'll be focusing on several key issues: the recent migration review by Martin Parkinson and others, which was announced as part of not announced, but it was released as part of a launch by the Minister for Home Affairs, Claire O'Neil, a couple of weeks ago. We will discuss the changes in the federal budget, which were announced last week. And then we'll discuss one of the major new announcements that was released at the same time around an aged care labour agreement. And finally, we will discuss where to from here. So thank you all for joining us. We'll try and keep this short and sharp. I understand everyone's on their, or most people will be on their lunch breaks. So first of all, introductions. I'd like to announce or introduce Yvette Gassick, who is joining Rome Migration Law from the 1st of May. Yvette is an immigration lawyer with 20 years of experience across immigration and practice management. We're very privileged and honoured to have Yvette join our firm, and we're very excited for her to join the team, share her knowledge with our clients and her expertise. Yvette has worked across some of the largest immigration firms in Australia, including the Big Four and some other immigration specialist law firms, both in terms of corporate work, individual matters, and litigation. So very excited to have Yvette join. So welcome, Yvette.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jackson, for that introduction. Appreciate it. Very excited to be joining the Rome team, particularly with Jackson leading the team, and the rest of the team that I think are on this webinar today. So thank you, Jackson.
Yeah, I think we're going to make some really great things happen in the space. There's a lot of exciting stuff. It's a very dynamic time, and I think that means
Absolutely.
that means there's a lot of opportunities as well.
Yes. Australian immigration is very much in the spotlight right now, as we all know. And there is a lot of discussion in the media, as you've probably seen, and particularly in relation to this migration review that the government released a few weeks back. So the focus of some of those outcomes that you'll see there, they really want to redesign the migration system and move some of the policy towards focusing more on skilled migration, and some of the adjacent programs, which includes obviously the International Student Visa Program. So some background around why, I'll just quickly touch on. Obviously there's been some challenges the government has noted in the current system where it's failed to prioritise migrants, and also, with the need to enhance our economic prosperity and security. People would agree, particularly those in the immigration space, that the system is too complex for employers and migrants. So there's a real push to simplify, a real sort of simplification that's going to happen. The system fails to deliver the right outcomes for us Australians and also migrants post-arrival. And it's not aligned with Australian values of integrity, fairness, and inclusion. So there is very much a push on compliance, we'll find, that's been announced by the Minister. So really the focus of the outcomes that have come from the review is to really build Australia's prosperity by lifting our productivity and meeting our workforce needs and supporting exports, enabling a fair labour market, building a community of Australians and protecting Australia's interests in the world, and obviously providing a fast, efficient and fair system. So what are some of these outcomes that have been announced? So for New Zealand citizens or permanent residents, certainly the New Zealand population here in Australia, they are obviously allowed to come into Australia on 444 visas, so they don't necessarily have to apply. It's automatic. And so for special category visa holders and permanent residents who've been in Australia for 4 years, they'll have a faster pathway to apply for citizenship from the 1st of July 2023. So that's a positive move. And certainly from the government's perspective, it was I guess a quick fix that they could provide as a solution to allow obviously skilled migrants such as New Zealanders who often contribute and pay tax here in Australia to contribute to the Australian economy in a quick way and allow them to stay. So that's a positive tick. International students, so the details around that, obviously their pathway to permanent residence will be streamlined. And so we want graduates who are here studying in Australia to stay and allow them a pathway that's a lot clearer and faster so that they actually stay and contribute to the Australian economy as opposed to leaving. And I think we saw, obviously with COVID, a big shift where a lot of our international students left and some did not come back or were forced out. And so if there's a clearer pathway for them to remain, then of course they will contribute and, to the Australian economy with the skills that they learn and study here, that they contribute and give back. And we know for a fact that, various places across Australia, particularly our regions, are suffering. And so allowing students to stay on is certainly going to be a quick fix for us here in Australia. A very important change, which I know a lot of you are interested in, is that the Minister has advised that the TSMIT, which is an abbreviation for the Temporary Skilled Migration Income Threshold, is going to be increased from 53,990 base salary up to 70,000 base salary from the 1st of July. So that is a welcome change in some respects. Some industries will find that challenging, where, for example, their market salaries might be below that in some occupations particularly, but businesses now particularly need to really reflect and review on the sort of salaries they're offering their visa holders. One of the big questions that's come up is if you lodge your application prior to 1 July, what does that mean post 1 July? And that is something that I know is very close to Jackson's heart around the TSMIT and the work that he does relating to the Migration Institute of Australia. That's something that's front of mind because it could be that there hasn't been, whilst the Minister made an announcement at the press club speech stating that 482 visa holders will be grandfathered at their current remuneration level, it's unclear exactly how they'll apply the new TSMIT. Because under the current legislation, if a visa holder receives less than the current TSMIT, they're not eligible for a further 482 visa. And if they wish to sponsor them for a further 482 in the same occupation, they wouldn't be eligible as their remuneration would be below the TSMIT. So there is some sort of clarification that's required as to confirmation, what's going to happen. And so I guess, well, certainly the MIA, which is our Migration Institute, that is our professional body, is keeping us as immigration lawyers and agents up to date on that. But as at this point, the preferred way or the better way to be advising clients is to really consider the new TSMIT and how that can be applied to new applications, perhaps if you're considering sponsoring someone who might be borderline, is to consider the new TISMIT and certainly market salary rates and how that applies. Did you want to make any further comment on that, Jackson? Because it may be, perhaps this is the time to probably explore that a little bit more.
Yes, so thanks, Yvette. I think when it comes to the TISMIT, my recommendation for employers is that they should assume that lodged applications will be assessed from 1 July against the new TISMIT. And as you say, that can pose issues. There has been some messaging in the industry coming out to the effect that there will be grandfathering. Now, grandfathering, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, means that people who were in the system prior to a certain date retain certain rights or certain settings within the program. But historically, when we go back 10 years to the way that TISMIT used to operate, there was no such grandfathering. And I think that my position, my concern is that those statements regarding TISMIT are based on some fairly loosely worded statements by the Minister for Home Affairs, who herself is not a migration professional and who was essentially summarising for the press gallery who were at the National Press Club. And I think the interpretation of those statements that she's made might have gone a bit too far. So we have sought, the MIA has sought clarification from the department. I have personally reached out to the Minister's office and asked them for clarification as well, but nothing has come out at this point. Now, just from a bigger picture perspective, with regards to TISMIT, this is an issue for industries where remuneration has been below that level for the past decade. And the issue is, if you can't apply at the current salary rate, it's going to have to go up to 70,000. Then there are knock-on effects within your workforce, because generally speaking, the issue is not for organisations where you sponsor a single ICT systems administrator or a single nurse. The issue is in industries where you've got a large number of visa holders. For example, hospitality is particularly affected by this, where a lot of chef de partie, entry-level chef roles are below that salary. In that situation, any organisation with that employee remuneration structure is going to have to deal with the potential implications of increasing salaries across the board and what that means for the business. So we will be running a special employer-only session in the next week or two where we discuss TISMIT issues in detail. And if you want to be invited to that, please do reach out to us. If you're an existing client, we will be sending an invitation. But if you'd like more information, please contact us. So I think that's probably enough on the TISMIT. It is a complex issue, and we could probably do a whole half-hour session on it. So if we might just leave it there, I think.
Yep. Thank you, Jackson. And then the other important outcome that's come from the migration review, which a lot of 482 visa holders will be happy about, is that you'll have a pathway to PR even if your occupation appears on what we call the Stutzel list, which is the short-term skilled occupation list, where a number of those occupations, well, in fact, all those occupations didn't really have a direct route to permanent residence. But from what they're actually looking at is this pathway to PR for all Stutzel holders, and that transition will be available after 2 years. So after you've actually held your 482 for 2 years, and then also there'll be a removal of a maximum of 2 onshore Stutzel 482 visa holders. There'll be no limit on the number of 482 visas available to you.
Yeah, sorry. And if I can, Yvette, I think that really goes back to this issue of Labor really distinguishing themselves from the previous government. Now, one of the allegations that occurred in sort of 2017, 2018 that was sort of put out there by certain people within the community was that, the 482 program, which denied about 60% of visa holders access to permanent residency, was inconsistent with Australian values because Australia had never had a guest worker program. And I think that assessment might be a little bit superficial, because the reality is that there are many, many people in Australia on temporary visas for an extended period who don't have access to permanent residency. But in any event, introducing a pathway to permanent residency for all 482 visa holders is indicative of a different approach, one that is more focused perhaps on incorporating those who contribute to our community into Australian society, but it comes at a price. And when I say it comes at a price, what I mean is there is a cap to the number of people who Australia invites each year to access permanent residency, and we can have positions one way or another on whether that should be higher or lower. But as it stands, it is unlikely to mean that everyone will get pathway to PR. You know, there's 1.5 million people on temporary visas in Australia at the moment, not including New Zealand citizens. The government is only inviting 190,000 people a year, which is still an increase from, you know, the past, to access permanent residency. So when you look at it, there is essentially 6 or 7 years worth of people onshore currently who would take up the entire program just themselves. And the reality is that not everyone who is here will get permanent residency, despite this position of the Labor government wanting to include a pathway for more people. And there's a tension there, I think, between this desire to incorporate people into the community and what is perceived as sort of a maximum capacity for the community to absorb at one given time. And that's a tension that I think the Labor government are trying to tread very carefully.
Yeah, very true. So, you know, obviously we've got a government that's trying to plug the skills shortage gaps that we're finding across the country. And obviously they're using these mechanisms as quick solutions. So they've really honed in and focused on where can we actually plug those gaps fairly quickly, or at least offer more of a labour force. And so obviously these focus areas that we've set out here are actually areas that the government has thought they can deal with quickly and provide a quick solution. So 482 visa holders have, as you know, obviously Jackson has set out, are temporary visa holders. And there's this real push to move migrants away from being permanently temporary and more into permanent residence so that they can stay longer and contribute to the Australian economy in a positive way and not be forced to leave, particularly those on the Stutzel that have had no pathway to permanent residence, and often they're highly skilled occupations. So there's a real push to keep them onshore and move them into a permanent state.
And just on that, there is a real nexus, there is a real connection between ongoing temporariness and worker exploitation. And this government really recognises that. And I think there is a genuine intention to address that. But that also means reducing the number of temporary visa holders in the economy. Reducing the number of temporary visa holders in the economy means fewer people working because there's less people coming in to do that work. And that means less cash coming into the economy. It also means that there are fewer people who, you know, quite often new migrants do jobs that Australians don't want to. And this is part of the discussion that I think the government is not having at the moment. The government's focus is higher skills, which is great and important, but there's a real gap in the Australian labour market where there are jobs Australians don't want to do, such as in aged care, such as in, you know, stacking shelves in supermarkets, working in fast food. But many migrants are willing to work in those jobs. And I'm concerned that the future direction of the program is not sufficiently considering that. But we'll continue to make representations on those issues to the government over the next sort of 6 months as that consultation period remains open.
Yep. And there are other programs as part of, you know, this review that are being reconsidered. So they would include some of those in business investor categories, which have obviously been their permanent residents, often those applications and those visas, but the reassessment of those has looked at their contribution to our economy and what it's actually, whether it's a positive thing. And so certainly some of those visas are going to be reconsidered, in addition to obviously these visas we've spoken about under the temporary migration pathways and skilled migration. Did we want to move on to the next slide?
Yeah, certainly.
We do have some questions in the chat room, I can see, but Jackson, will we keep those to the end to respond to?
I've been responding to some of them in real time, so I'm more than happy for you to respond. There's an option there, Yvette, for you to type an answer. So you can certainly type an answer as we go, and we can address some of the bigger picture issues perhaps that come up at the end of the session and continue taking those questions. So I'll speak now to the federal budget. The federal budget, for those who aren't familiar, is obviously the government setting out all of the money that's going to go out in the economy from government in the next 12 months, as well as the money that's coming in. The migration program, meaning the number of permanent places that are allocated, as well as an overview of the total number of people coming into Australia and leaving Australia, what's called net overseas migration. Those are two of the key factors that are looked at in the budget from an immigration perspective. So as part of that 23-24 planning year, so the migration year runs from 1 July through until 30 June the next year, in the same way that the Australian financial year runs. The government's allocating 190,000 places. Now, that is a high point in many respects. That's sort of like the high watermark in the number of places. It's the same as last year, but higher than the sort of the years before. And in particular, during COVID, there was a bit of suppression on those numbers. Those numbers weren't sort of fully allocated from what I recall. Importantly, the government has allocated 137,000 of these to skilled stream. Now, there are 3 streams in this context. There is a family stream, which relates to partner visas, parent visas, and so forth, other family members. There is a skilled stream, which relates to independent skilled migration, business investment visas, employer-sponsored visas. They're probably the 3 main categories of permanent skilled visa. And then there's the refugee cohort. Now, what we can see here is that 137,000 places have been allocated to skilled. Now, that itself is a little bit difficult to unpack because some of these programs are what is called demand driven. And that means that if a place is requested, then in theory, the government actually has to grant that position. So these numbers are a little bit rubbery, but you can see that broadly speaking, the intention of the government is to allocate a significant number of places, permanent places, to people who are making a contribution to the economy. Now, we can discuss what that means, but the government has its own perspective on what that means. At the moment, it means highly skilled people in highly skilled roles, often earning significant amounts of money, certainly above the TISMET and higher. We've also seen an announcement of some increases in the fees and charges. Now, it is a little bit ambiguous as to how this is framed, but my interpretation is that there is likely to be a 10 to 12% increase on fees and charges, because my reading is that there's a 6% increase plus CPI. Okay, so that would lead to a 10 to 12% increase. That is largely speaking across the board, but there are a few categories that will increase more significantly. In particular, the business investment visas. Visitor and tourist visas are likely to increase 40% or will increase 40%. And those are the main exemptions. Those are also exceptions from that sort of 10 to 12% increase. We'll see temporary graduate visas with the 485 visas. There will be an extended period. So one of the things that the government is trying to do is keep all of those people with what it perceives as highly valuable skills in the economy longer. And that's likely why we've seen the subclass 408 COVID stream visa sticking around. It really is about retaining people longer in the economy so they can continue to contribute and hopefully identify a pathway to a longer term permanent visa. Similarly, they will be expanding, the government has finally called time on the unlimited student work hours. It will be wound back, however, to a slightly higher level of 48 hours per fortnight. Okay, it was previously 40 hours. Then during the COVID period, it was unlimited. From 1 July, the government will be winding it back to 48 hours per fortnight, except for those working in the aged care sector. Now, we do not have clarification on the disability support sector or the broader healthcare sector in regards to international student visas, but we are making representations to government that this should be addressed because these are sectors that are really crying out for people. They're sectors that also have a very direct connection with what you might call the public interest. That's not to say that supermarkets or fast or restaurants or others don't benefit the public, but you can see that when it comes to disability support, the NDIS, aged care and healthcare, they form a really critical part of the need of the Australian community. So hopefully we'll see a bit of an expansion there, but uncertain at this stage. Yvette, did you have any comments on the budget and the way that things are being handled now?
I think it's, again, consistent with where the government could see some quick fixes. So certainly the temporary graduate post-study work rights extension is a quick fix, and we could actually benefit from students staying onshore and taking on roles in these industries of shortage. So for example, in the aged care industry or disability sectors, construction, etc., hospitality. And similarly with the international student work hours back to 48 hours a fortnight, except in aged care. Again, that's supporting an industry that's in quite a dire straits at the moment. So I think that focus on those two areas is certainly consistent with that approach. The increase in fees, I believe, is going to generate something like 500 million for the government in revenue. So certainly that's pretty clever on their part. It's a revenue stream. And of course, if someone wants to come to migrate to any country, you've got to pay. The increase in the percentages, I think, is carefully considered because they're looking at where the volumes are, I imagine, and where they can actually gain more. So business and innovation and investment visa stream is up 40%, actually, the fees. You mentioned the visitor working holiday, training visas and temporary work, so the short stay 400 visas, they're going up by 15%, as you've mentioned. Other visas around the 6%. The only one I can see that's exempt is under the PALM schemes, which is the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Visas, which are really, the sort of, again, another access to labour in sort of lower skilled areas. They're focusing on the Pacific, and that's through DFAT. It's not really an immigration policy, but certainly accessing and strengthening our ties with the Pacific. But it's to be seen how successful that program is, I guess, because the flow-on effect, I imagine, of bringing in palm workers is that you're sort of depleting villages in Fiji, Samoa, of their labour to bring them in. So be interesting to see the impacts long-term of our palm scheme. The intentions are good, but the broader implications perhaps have not been studied, perhaps on the other side in terms of how that impacts our Pacific friends.
Yeah, and recently, I'll note that recently, I think it was the president of Solomon Islands, perhaps, one of the prime ministers in one of the Pacific states, and this isn't an issue I follow very closely, so my apologies if I've gotten it wrong, but has actually called for free movement between Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific, which is a very interesting concept, and one that I think the government will find very challenging to deal with because incomes in those countries can be very low. I think the average income in Fiji is about 4,000 Australian a year. So trying to establish a regime with free movement would obviously be very beneficial for those countries in some respects. But as you say, there's this incredible tension between just stripping people out of those countries, given the disparity. It's a very complex question, and certainly one that's outside the scope of my ability to deal with. So I note that we're running a bit short on time.
Yes,
so
we might keep moving along, I think, quickly.
Now, the aged care labour agreement, I'll speak quickly to this. So there are industry labour agreements. This has been a feature of the system for more than a decade, certainly maybe 15 or 20 years. Labour agreements allow organisations to access people who wouldn't be available, or to access roles, more specifically, that wouldn't be available under the standard 482 visa program. So in this may mean access to bus drivers or access to a particular occupation where the candidates might not meet the standard criteria. So for example, during the mining boom, it was very popular. There'd be a labour agreement, for example, for 50 welders, and they might get an exemption or a variation on the English language requirement. So people didn't have to have the standard level of English. So labour agreements are either by industry or by company, and industry labour agreements already exist for a number of agricultural sectors, such as horticulture industry labour agreement, fishing, pork industry, dairy, and then meat industry is a big one. And then there are also more. There are also agreements in other areas, such as fast food, not fast food, sorry, fine dining.
Yeah.
The aged care labour agreement has been under discussion for a number of years. I would suggest at least 3 now, and it's recently been announced. Now, one of the key features that the incoming Labor government, or the Albanese Labor government, are introducing into the immigration system more and more, and it's noted in the Parkinson Review, is a tripartite approach. Now, tripartite means involvement of government, employer representatives and unions, and that's very distinct from the previous Liberal National government, who sought to minimise involvement of unions entirely. But tripartite arrangements are quite common in sort of international workplace issues in places such as the International Labour Organization, who set labour standards and so forth. But this aged care labour agreement has that tripartite component, meaning that employers who want to use this program need to engage with the relevant union in their sector to get a memorandum of understanding. The flip side, or the benefit for the employers, is that they gain access to nursing assistants, personal care assistants, disability support workers, aged care workers. From what we have seen in reaching out to the unions, these agreements are limited to the aged care sector. So they don't extend to disability. They don't extend to public healthcare. It's really just that private and not-for-profit healthcare sector at this stage, but we are seeking clarification on that. Now, the benefit of being able to access those occupations is that they haven't historically been eligible for visas. The government is introducing a visa with a pathway to permanent residency after 2 years. The skills required are very low by 482 visa standards. You can either have a certificate 3 in a relevant field and no work experience, or you can have 12 months full-time work experience on a pro rata basis if needed, and gain access to this visa. So that's incredibly important in this sector for people who are recruiting from the international student community, for example. And internationally, what we're seeing is that a lot of organisations who are looking at these options are actually recruiting registered nurses from overseas into aged care roles. And then those people have the opportunity to sort of upskill in future in Australia, which is really important because the changes recommended during the Royal Commission into aged care have meant that going forward, I think it's from November at this stage, aged care facilities will need to have a registered nurse on staff 24/7. So there's this real shortage of registered nurses in public healthcare, but also in the aged care sector. And that's something that is really going to become apparent in the next 6 to 12 months. So this aged care labour agreement may go somewhere to addressing that, but we still don't know what the content of those memorandum of understandings are with the union. We've sought clarification. It's still pending, but it is an interesting move overall, and hopefully one that will very broadly benefit the Australian community as well as employers in this sector.
Yep, and they've also one of the other concessions is the salary, so it's a lot lower than the TSMIT.
Yeah, it's actually lower than the current TSMIT. That's right.
Yes.
So it's from 53 down to, I think, 53,900 to 51 something.
222.
Yeah. Okay.
And the English concessions as well.
Yeah, so 70. So the TSMIT going forward will be 70, but for the aged care sector, it will be 51. Very interesting decision. I think it has I think it shows that this government is, whilst they have their agenda, they're not deeply ideological. There is a pragmatic element at work here, but it will be interesting to see what additional requirements the MOU with the union impose, because there wouldn't be any purpose in having an MOU if it didn't impose any additional conditions. So we'll have further information on that soon.
Yep, excellent. I think the first labour agreement under this was the aged care one was WA. I think it got approved last week.
Oh, really? That was fast off the fast moving.
It was the very first one.
It is also interesting to note that there were labour agreements in this sector before. This just sets an industry standard.
Correct. Yeah. And it's probably setting a precedent of where we're headed. If there are concessions required for certain industries, it's the labour agreement is the way to go.
Absolutely.
And working with the unions to make sure it goes smoothly. Okay, so where do we go from here? Again, I think Jackson mentioned, obviously the government is very much about being consultative in this sort of tripartite approach, but there's still, consultations to be had. And it certainly has not finished as a result of the review. That sort of parts of it was released last month. There's still a way to go. So those consultations will continue with the states and the regions over the next couple of months up to June. What we're hoping to hear come June and into the new financial year, some of those streamlining measures, hopefully they'll be released progressively, a bit like they've done where they've announced the New Zealand citizens, new sort of streamlining, the international students, etc. They'll probably start to drip feed a few more through between now and September, or June and September. And then come October, we estimate that the release of the final review in terms of how they're planning to simplify the simplification of the immigration system, which then will have flow-on effects for legislation. And one of the big ones we're hoping is that these, number of these lists that we have, as an example, might get consolidated or might be removed altogether. And they've spoken about, the jobs and skills, the correct name has slipped my, is it the jobs and skills industry body that will actually provide a lot more input into setting occupations and seeing where the gaps are rather than having lists. So it may be that we become more reliant on that, but it's yet to be seen. So there's a lot of recommendations or suggestions being put forward. I believe the Joint Standing Committee is having another catch up today before Parliament. So I think that discussion is continuing today in sort of further recommendations and suggestions that are being considered. And then once the changes and the legislation impacts have been released, or the simplification has been provided in terms of legislation, of course, it's going to be an ongoing review of how is this lever of tweaking the immigration program actually impacting our workforce. So it's going to be an ongoing thing to see, are we improving? That is, are the shortages reducing in those sectors where there's need? Are the regions receiving the people that they need in the occupations of shortage up there? So hospitality being one example in those regions across Australia. So there'll be reviews in terms of looking at that across the board. So it won't just be immigration looking at that. I imagine it'll be across different departments within government focusing in on that. So it's interesting times ahead. And as we mentioned at the beginning, immigration is certainly a hot topic right now. And so certainly a number of you who are on visas or considering permanent residence, it is a good time to have a discussion around your pathway if you're concerned, or similarly, if you're an employer, to consider your current workforce and strategically planning the way forward in terms of how these changes may impact your immigration strategy for the year ahead. So certainly reach out to us to have that discussion. We're certainly happy to, and I know Jackson, Rome has always actually reached out to clients or made the time to sit down and have those discussions with relevant stakeholders if needed. So we're certainly open to that. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'll hand it over to you, Jackson, to make any closing remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Yvette. I think one thing that we should be aware of is, from my perspective, the Labor government did have a roadmap in place largely prior to this, and I think that this could be seen in the Grattan Institute report from I think it was 2022 and 21 into temporary and permanent migration. I think they had a vision of what they wanted to do. So I think that there is, from my perspective, the review that the big picture review that Parkinson and John Azarias and Joanna Howe did were really about sort of almost justifying the medium term. The Azarias review, the Parkinson review was, here's the big picture, 10 years, 20 years down the track. But they knew what they wanted to do in the medium term to get there, with things like abolishing the ANZCO and these sort of things, raising TISMET. I think there is scope for negotiation and discussion, and I think the fact that this government has, shown itself open to quite innovative ideas in immigration is a positive thing. We can see, for example, the Pacific Lottery idea. So the
Yes.
government introducing like a green card lottery type concept for Pacific nations, which hasn't existed in Australia, does in New Zealand, and obviously does in the US. But it shows to me that they're open to various ideas within limits. I think there are blind spots in the current government, and I think that they relate primarily to what I would call sort of blue collar labour, and that sort of idea of wanting to constantly focus on the economic impact and sort of, wanting to capture the next Facebook or the next, big business that's going to, generate $1 billion, but ignoring, well, the temporary visa holders who are in the system now, they're the ones who are stacking shelves. They're the ones who are working in hospitality. They're the ones who are doing jobs that Australians don't want to do. Now, there are all sorts of moral and ethical ambiguities there around, should you force migrants to, or should migrants be taking these jobs? I think that from a pragmatic perspective, the reality is that migrants historically have always come to places, and often many of those people take jobs that locals don't want to do. And the migrant story is they work very hard, they do amazing things, and you can see this in past generations of Italian and Greek
Yes,
migration, and their
absolutely.
kids are the next lawyers and surgeons and doctors and all these sort of things, right? Because mum and dad work really hard and the kids go and study, and that's sort of that's the way that's the sort of deal that they understand. And I think that, whilst that's ethically challenging in some respects, everyone should be offered the same opportunities, etc. That's a practical reality. And I think it's something that the government of the day isn't recognizing. And it's something that I will continue to sort of discuss. Obviously, I'm not a labour market economist, but I think that there are relevant issues there that are being missed. So I guess that's my sort of big picture takeaway from what's happening at the moment.
Thanks, Jackson. We had one question here that maybe we won't really know the answer to, but I'll put it out there.
Mm.
One of the questions was, before we close, how long do we think the COVID 408 visa will hang around for? There hasn't really been an announcement.
What would your guess be? What would your guess be?
Well, I would say at least another year or two.
Yeah. Okay. I think the government's running this really difficult. They're running this real tightrope at the moment within the economy, and I think immigration, as you pointed out, Yvette, sits in a really important place in the economy because over the last decade or so, if the economy is dipping down, the government will introduce more temporary visa holders into the local economy. What does that do? They spend money, they earn money, they generate more economic activity, and it sort of boosts the economy. But at the moment, we've got a perspective from the government that the economy is running too hot, and that's why they're increasing interest rates. So I think one of the issues is we're in this weird economic moment where there is inflation, the economy is running too hot, interest rates are going up, but everyone's understaffed. No one can find workers.
Right.
So how do you address those issues? And I think that's a real tension that the government is unsure of. And I think that you're right. I don't think they know when the 408 will get turned off.
Yeah.
My guess would be January next year.
Right. That's pretty soon. I guess as you said, this economic uncertainty that we're in, and this is a global phenomenon right now post-COVID, making any drastic changes right now when we don't know where we're going in terms of cost of living pressures, etc. Then this is a ready workforce that we have here, and so it's they're not going to make any drastic move just yet.
That would certainly be my guess.
Yeah.
I think one of the other questions here is does Rome conduct obligation-free initial consultations? Well, we conduct paid consultations, and if you wish to engage us after the consultation and instruct us to proceed with a visa application within 10 days, we include the consultation fee in the visa charge. But unfortunately, we and probably most migration agents and lawyers are too busy at the moment to do anything for free. It's a time of incredible pressure in the industry because there is so much uncertainty, so much temporariness, and the visa system is, as I'm sure you're all aware, incredibly complicated. So unfortunately, we can't offer free consultations, but we do deduct the price of consultations from applications if instructed to do so. Does the new TISMIT not apply to applications lodged before 1 July? The answer is we don't know, but I expect that it will. Undecided nominations will go to the new TISMIT, but that remains to be confirmed. Yvette, did you see any other questions here?
There was one where, yeah, someone was considering applying for PR. They're currently on a 482. It's hard to advise you directly without seeing your actual background and your work experience. So I think the best way is to probably reach out to us, and we could do an eligibility assessment, which we do for clients. We do charge a fee, as Jackson said, but that gets discounted against any subsequent fees you pay if you engage us to assist you with your immigration work.
Yeah, and I might just make a final sort of wrapping up point, I guess, because we are already at 10 to 1. So thank you for everyone who's taken the time to stick around. I really appreciate it. In regards to that question about access to permanent residency, my current take on the situation and what's happening is the government has announced essentially that they'll double the amount of money going into compliance and monitoring. And compliance and monitoring have been a very low level for the last decade. Okay, some may suggest somewhat deliberately, but as a result, we are going to see an increase in audit, compliance, monitoring activities. So if you're an employer, it's something that you really should be thinking about, where is my budget for immigration compliance? Because it's really obvious that immigration is a critical part of most people's workforce planning in 2023. There aren't enough Australians to do all the jobs. So are you protecting your access to temporary skilled visa holders? Okay, so that's one point. The next point is the government is trying to find this balance between protecting the rights of visa holders in the workforce, preventing exploitation, but at the same time trying to, how can I put it, balance that with the needs of employers, okay? And that's not to say that the government approves in any way of exploitation, but there are costs to employers to sponsor people for visas, okay? And the challenge that is before the government, and I suspect they're aware of it because they are being informed by some very, very knowledgeable people. The problem that is before the government is, for example, particularly in the employer-sponsored space, you want to give people access to permanent residency. You want to remove the levers of exploitation. One of the key levers here is the employer role in the permanent 186 nomination. We can see that with the 191, which is the new permanent regional visa that's related to the 494, the government has actually removed the employer nomination component. You can just apply directly for the permanent visa after you've done 2 years, okay, of work, or 3 years, I think, actually. The issue for the government to address is, okay, so if you're going to remove, and I think this is quite possible, that they remove the employer nomination component from the 186 and allow people to go to PR without it. The issue there will be the employers just paid the SAF levy of $7,200, for example, plus migration fees, plus nomination fees, plus they've had to then upskill and train that person in their business. If that person can go through to permanent residency after 2 years, that's good and well, but the business has to do something in terms of ensuring that it gets value for money in that sponsorship arrangement.
Yeah.
And if the government does it the wrong way, businesses won't be willing to sponsor because they'll be thinking, well, I'm going to pay $10,000 for this, and then I've got no real reason to think the person's going to stick around. So this is the challenge that the government is trying to balance. And I don't know that there is any good solution to this issue, but I think that is the challenge that's before them.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's often been the challenge with permanent residents, but certainly in sort of streamlining it and making it easier to access, some employers have looked at clawback provisions in employment contracts, whereby individuals, if they left within a certain period, would have to pay back all those fees that have been attributed to their permanent residence application. But then that also proposes its own challenges in trying to get the money back as well. So there's no perfect solution, I think, but certainly they're considering options to allow streamlining and providing that ability for people to move from temporary to permanent states, and not permanently be uncertain about their future in Australia, which I think has been a bit of a problem to date under the prior system.
Yeah, it is. Temporariness inherently is precarious.
Yes.
It's uncertain. It's
And the uncertainty.
contingent.
Yes.
There's a decade or two of academic papers on this topic across Australia, Canada, because it's such an issue. But I guess the last thing that I would say, just in relation to all of this, is I think what's going on in the economy is that the government is looking at what you might call the price of rights. Okay, so the price of rights is an academic concept in immigration policy where the more rights a migrant has in the country, the fewer of them a country will let in, because the more expensive it is to provide those rights.
Yeah.
Okay. And one example, one extreme might be like places like the UAE, where people have very little OH&S, very little minimum salary guarantees, are essentially kept in quarters by the employer who holds their passport. At the other end of the scale, you've got places like Australia and Sweden and this sort of stuff, where people essentially have more or less, and in Australia it is less, freedom of movement, but also access to, like in some countries, people have access to Medicare and social benefits and all this sort of stuff. You can afford as a country a lot of people with very few rights, but fewer people with lots of rights. That's just sort of an economic principle, right? The issue that is before the government is they want to move more towards the more rights, and that costs money. And the challenge, I think, at the moment is the reliance on temporary migrants in the economy versus this price of rights concept. And I think that what we will see over the next decade is actually a decrease in the number of international students per capita, because they're the main workforce, not meaning to be disparaging of of international students. I think international students are amazing, but they're the ones that are doing a lot of the work, and they're often coming in to do these very low value courses in low quality organizations. And I think if you look at the statements that Claire O'Neill was making, and someone asked a question about this, I think we're going to see a reduction in the number of international students with a focus more on universities and less on those lower quality courses as part of this trade-off on the price of rights concept.
Right. Definitely interesting times ahead. And as you've said, other countries are facing similar challenges. Our education sector took a big hit from COVID, and I think it's going to take some time to recover. But certainly the international students offer and contribute a lot to the Australian economy in terms of the work that they do. And I think this is a move by the government to also show that they're highly valued, and they're very much focused on the integrity of the system and ensuring there isn't that exploitation that's going on across all different types of, visa types.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I mean, I'm not sure if people in the audience saw the leak from the is Christine Milne? No, it's not Christine Milne. The former Victorian head of police. There was a report that she was asked to do relating to exploitation and abuse in the system. Now, that paper hasn't been released by the government, but it was leaked, and The Age had a story about it yesterday about exploitation in this sector and the failures of the department and the government over the last few years to address this. And I think that really shows that A, this government is interested in those things, but B, it also shows the challenges that are in front of them.
And compliance and monitoring is going to be a huge focus going forward.
It's the only way to do it. It's the only way to do it. They need to spend that money.
Yeah. And they've committed that in the budget. They made that very clear.
Yeah.
So we'll see a more of an enforcement approach as well.
Very likely. I mean, the fees and charges in this space for employers who are non-compliant are very low compared to other areas. We've seen the similar fees under the Fair Work legislation be increased by tenfold. Okay, so and some academics in that space are even saying that is too low, and that penalties in the employer industrial relations and employment law area should be proportionate to turnover, as they are in many European jurisdictions. But in Australia, our immigration fees are low, and there's a number of people, I think Grattan are recommending a tenfold increase, which would really, I think, potentially change the dynamic. But as we know, you've got to enforce those laws for them to be meaningful to employers. But we've talked a lot, Yvette. It's been a pleasure.
Yes.
I hope everyone's enjoyed the session. I will stick around for a moment or two to answer a few more questions, but thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next time on our presentation. Thank you for joining us. It's been a great pleasure. And we look forward to seeing you all in future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yvette. Okay. If anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to just type it here. Talk about labour agreements when people are over 45. So Jenny, labour agreements can be negotiated in some circumstances where people are over 45 for a concession. However, industry labour agreements cannot be varied. So, for example, one of our main concerns about the aged care labour agreement is it has a maximum age of 45, which is problematic. And in theory, you can't negotiate a aged care labour agreement where well, you can't negotiate a labour agreement in an industry where there is already an industry agreement. So that is a challenge, and it's something that we'll be raising with government. So just going through all the questions now. Pathway to permanent residency on the 191 after 2 years instead of 3. It's entirely possible. I think that there will be an effort to make these pathways consistent across visa types, but I think we'll just have to wait and see. It's in the likely basket, or very likely basket, in my opinion. For our charges, please look at our website, www.romemigrationlaw.com. Thank you. Rebecca, for people who've recently obtained a 482, yes, the government has indicated that the pathway to PR will be decreased to 2 years. No answer on exactly when that will occur. Sharon, I'll discuss that with you separately if that's okay. Yeah, Richard, you will certainly get access. You'll get an email to the answers that were, or sorry, you'll get an email to the full recording, so no problems. Mikhail, does the reduction to 2 years apply to the medium term? They haven't said explicitly, but it is very likely. It would be very strange for them to have different periods of time required to access permanent residency. And the aged care labour agreement is 2 years as well. So I think that there will be a consistent 2 year work requirement on the 482 to access permanent residency. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. Real pleasure. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us afterwards. You'll all receive an email with a recording of the session. Thank you so much, and wishing you all a fantastic day.